Hi, it's me Imogen, and today I'm going to be talking about my thoughts on Thomas Hardy's 1891 novel Tess of the d'Urbervilles. I'm not sure that anything I say is going to really provide a new perspective, as the novel is old and very well known in Victorian literature spheres. However, this will be more of an informal review of more just my thoughts, because it had a very significant impact on me. One of my favourite novels of all time is Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy, and when I read that book, I cried multiple times. Similarly, I cried reading this because it is a very depressing book, and I think some people describe it as too bleak, as Tess is really punished from start to finish for the most part. There is a cast of characters in the novel who add a lot to the atmosphere, but primarily it does focus on Tess and two men who essentially terrorise her in their own unique ways throughout the novel. There are also Tess's sort of co-workers on farms that she works on, as well as her family, who are not depicted very favourably either. I think Thomas Hardy really enjoys describing rural landscapes of England, and he does that very well in Tess. He goes to great detail to describe both the beautiful sides of nature and also the harshness of it, and the way that the seasons change is really well described in a way that almost kind of reflects the character's feelings, as well as using specific surroundings to highlight nostalgia and sentimentality, and also frustration and a sense of claustrophobia. As well as this, the way that he describes emotions, either through a character's internal thoughts or his narration of their thoughts as an outsider, they are possibly unparalleled. I think they are just it's so raw and intense, and also quite sympathetic. And I think as a human being, it's just there's something reassuring about reading in the way that he doesn't hold back in describing the full spectrum of human emotion. I think it can really make one feel understood in their own human thoughts, feelings, and even their anguishes and anxieties. Like Jude the Obscure, Tess is a tragedy. It's pretty much steeped in constant tragedy, with only brief moments of respite which are overturned by awful events. I think it's fairly understood that Hardy wanted to highlight a sense of fatalism. He wanted to talk about, or use stories to describe the way that life is unpredictable and the universe is unforgiving and essentially has no mercy for anyone. You see, it's a very bleak perspective, and it reflects the movement of naturalism, I suppose, where, along with the unflinching descriptions of human struggles and the uncontrollable nature of the course life takes, it does also allow for relatable storytelling. Essentially, Tess is born into unfortunate circumstances. She's born into a relatively large family, a lot of young siblings, and two parents who spend most of their time drinking and doing little to actually support their children. Tess takes all the responsibility for earning money for the family and looking out for the children. Upon the death of the family horse, which Tess feels immeasurable guilt for, the family decide to send Tess to claim kin with a Mrs. d'Urberville in the area, or just outside of the area. Upon arriving, though, she doesn't meet Mrs. d'Urberville originally, she meets Alec d'Urberville, who is essentially a very significant antagonist throughout the novel. And so from there, Tess is forced to endure suffering. Life does not seem to have any room for forgiveness to Tess, or understanding or grace. Tess's family, or Tess's mother, didn't really put in the effort to, at least as the novel seems to suggest, they didn't really teach her anything about the outside world beyond work and her own family. They kind of already have the idea that she'll hopefully find a gentleman to marry through claiming kin with Mrs. d'Urberville and working for her. And I guess they were right in the fact that she does meet a man, a wealthy young man who wants to marry her. However, instead of anything romantic happening particularly, this man, Alec, takes advantage of young Tess, and Tess doesn't really understand that she should say no. She doesn't really understand that she has the rights to. She feels that as a result, because of her guilt, she needs to atone for this by going along with anything that happens so that she can at least earn money and help her family out. In contrast to her experience with Alec, she does meet a man later on called Angel, who she does fall for and who allegedly claims to fall for her too. I think there is great debate about how genuine his love can be, as Angel abandons Tess when he finds out about her past with Alec, because back then women had to be pure and virginal to be acceptable wives to men, regardless of what the man may have done beforehand himself. As you can see, like with Jude the Obscure, Thomas Hardy explores the legitimacy of Christian beliefs and beliefs on morality, sexuality, and gender roles that society pushed in the Victorian era, and he does it very powerfully. Through Tess, I think Hardy really explores the experience of women in the Victorian era and the way that with a lack of rights and not really being seen at all as equal with men, comes real issues of safety and vulnerability. It was so much harder to be able to create a life for yourself without relying on somebody and marrying somebody who then you are property to. The concept of marriage is very much explored in Jude the Obscure as well, where the idea of real love is kind of conflicted with the sort of religious Victorian understanding of marriage, and it becoming a sort of legalized, cold and sort of clinical binding between people. He kind of argues that maybe it's not necessary to be married for romance and love to be legitimate. And Tess is less focused on this concept. However, it does come up multiple times where Tess seems to quite constantly be asked to be married by the two men in the novel. I think in both instances it's not really portrayed in a very positive, warm way. It's almost like it intrudes into her life. When Tess falls in love, the man that she falls in love with very quickly decides he wants to marry her. And I think this isn't unusual at all for that time. However, Tess being herself and with her past, essentially she is taken advantage of against her will as a young girl and bears a child who passes away. Tess feels that it's not right for her to keep this a secret, but it seems to be that her not keeping a secret dooms her perpetually. I don't think Hardy is saying that that is her fault. I think it really is just, it highlights the way that women could not be forgiven for anything they did that wasn't being pure and virginal and perfect. Tess gets married in the novel to Angel, who she falls in love with. However, she repeatedly says no to him to marriage. She repeatedly tries to tell him of her past because she doesn't want to be married by someone thinking that she isn't what she is. Of course, trauma does not make a person who they are, but I suppose she feels in her heart she wants to be accepted for who she is and for everything that she's gone through. She wants to be accepted as a whole and not just an image of a woman. But unfortunately, because of the era, she couldn't really get away with it. And Angel himself is portrayed as a very insecure individual whose religious teachings from his parents do permeate his mind more than he likes to believe. And not in the... Ironically, his parents are more forgiving to those who have sinned and suffered than he is. In his mind, Tess was the perfect, pure image of femininity. And when he finds out about what has happened to her, he breaks down and leaves her. Though Angel knows of her circumstances, he leaves her completely and leaves the country, and she's left to fend for herself. Now, in modern day, this sort of situation wouldn't have quite the same weight, in the sense that a woman is allowed to live independently. But back then, it kind of ruins her. The man who traumatized her in the first place finds her whereabouts and terrorizes her once more. Because her family is suffering, she feels more and more worn thin trying to support them from a distance, and she gives in to this man because he can provide her stability and money and finance to look after the children and make sure that they're safe. She couldn't seem to be able to just, as a result of being taken advantage of and traumatized at her age, Victorian society did not have the room for her and the understanding for her to make a life for herself. In contrast to this, though, I do think there is a strong sense among readers that Tess is a frustrating character. Tess constantly seems to berate herself. She's sickened by her own guilt. She seems to believe that anything awful that happens to her is justified because of her past, and repeatedly in the novel describes wanting to die, essentially. Personally, I find that it's plausible that she feels this way. She's never really experienced any warm or love from anyone except for the man that she married, and that man left her alone because of the things that she endured outside of her control. She's 16 at the beginning of the novel, I think, and about 21 towards the end. So she's not even been around that long, and all she's written to have experienced is suffering, essentially. And maybe the sequences of events in the novel are too bleak. Some events or sequences of events do admittedly sometimes feel a little bit contrived, like the scene where Angel's two very cold and closed off Christian brothers find Tess's work boots and steal them, and so she's left without work boots despite the labor she has to do for a living. It just really, he really piles the events on just in every way that he can. But at the same time, I also feel that it is believable. I think it reflects real lives when events really can just go wrong, especially living under Victorian morals. Probably a lot of people lived lives like Tess where they were just unable to catch a break, really. But I suppose in the realm of literature and of fiction, it isn't always the most enjoyable thing to read. But I think I respect that Hardy is so unflinching in his depictions of tragic lives. I think for me, the highlights of the novel are maybe not the exact events that take place, but more just the enjoyment of his writing, the way he uses language. His sentences are really beautiful. And the character of Tess, I really like her. I don't feel the same frustration to her that a lot of readers seem to feel. And I just believe that her circumstances did not ever allow for her to be comfortable or happy, and I think it's very natural that this causes her to not be able to think in a very positive way. It's just upsetting, I suppose, having to read of a character who hates themselves so much. But she does have a good heart. I think she's a kind-hearted and loving individual, which makes it the more tragic. There is a moment in the novel where Alec says to Tess, in trying to win her over a second time into marriage after she's already married Angel, he says to her, "Once a victim, always a victim," or something to that effect. And I feel that line really haunted me, and I think it really depicts quite succinctly the plight of a lot of women in the Victorian era. I don't feel that the suffering throughout the novel is entirely misplaced. I don't think it was too gratuitous. I think it just is very honest, really, or at least that's my view of it. I think perhaps almost the trauma of being a woman is a difficult thing to depict in a novel without being quite confrontational and being hard to read, but I think that just makes it more authentic. Even if this is coming from a man, I think he still does a decent job at describing these real truths through the Victorian lens. I would say that I found the first half more enjoyable than the second. I just really enjoyed the descriptions of the countryside and of Tess as a milkmaid and her love of animals, and the way that her feelings are kind of conveyed as she realizes that she actually feels joy when she meets Angel, which I suppose makes it more painful, knowing the way that he turns on her. I think there is something relatively timeless, though, in the way that their blossoming feelings are described, in the way that they're kind of both tentative and in such odd circumstances to meet each other. I think perhaps if the ending hadn't been quite so awful, maybe the book would be easier to digest, and I think a part of me does wish that there had been a little bit more of a reprieve for Tess. I also take it as it is, because it makes sense that Tess is executed by the end, or at least that's what is suggested, without graphic details. I think it's just kind of a fact that what Victorian society viewed as a woman's sins and mistakes, they wouldn't have been understanding about it, because Tess does murder the man who essentially ruined her life, when she realizes what's really happened, and she realizes that, I mean, there are different ways to interpret her murder and why she does it, but I think the frustration lies in what she had been harboring the entire time. She's essentially in survival mode for most of the novel, and when she kind of faces what she wanted from life, and the fact that she'll never really be able to have it, or at least feels that she won't, her brain snaps. Again, she didn't need to murder the man to have found a life worth living, I think, but I don't think Thomas Hardy wanted to write a happy, cheerful novel, so this is what we have, and I appreciate it for what it is. Though a lot of the novel is quite cold and harsh, the ending passages before the cruel ending, there is a very surreal sense in it. It's quite dreamlike, and I really enjoyed that too. I quite like the contrast of it, the way that it's almost a calm before the storm, where her and Angel are kind of almost on the run, just traversing the lower end of England after she has committed the murder. It's really the only time that they are a married couple, and enjoy each other's company, where Tess is finally treated kindly by someone, and even though it may just be a facade by Angel having returned sick and unhealthy himself after his trip is more or less a failure, there is something very strange about it that I oddly enjoyed. I also feel that there maybe was a bit too much focus on Angel's inner thoughts and not enough of Tess's, considering that she is the central character. But really, when it comes down to it, I love and appreciate a lot of Hardy's perspectives and what fuels his writing. I believe that it is quite truthful, where Hardy essentially suggests that life is very much tragic. It's oftentimes tragic for a lot of people, and always has been since humans have been alive. But that an equal amount of this tragedy is that it is all down to our own decisions for most of it. I mean, half of life is uncontrollable actions, and half of it is what we do surrounding these actions. Sometimes things really are beyond our control. I'm not sure that I believe with the fatalism angle. I'm not sure that I agree with Hardy that everything is preordained, but I do believe that the nature of life is almost preordained, that we can only do what we can do with the moments we are given and the resources that we can find or are given. And it's once we gain the ability to create our own worldview that our actions count the most. But it is obviously most tragic when individuals are not able to follow their own dreams, or even have their own dreams because of the imposed rules of society around them, such as women in the Victorian era. So overall, it was quite a mixed novel for me. It was quite dreary, and in some points I did have to take breaks because it was too much. But overall, I really appreciated it. I think it was a very well written novel, and I really loved that it didn't hold back. So yeah, those are my thoughts, or at least the majority of my thoughts on Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Thank you for watching.